The silver spoon didn't just sit in Julian Vane's mouth. It was his primary weapon. As the CEO of Vane and Volition, the world's most exclusive luxury food conglomerate, Julian viewed the act of eating as a theological exercise. To him, food was not sustenance, it was a boundary line. "Look at them, Arthur," Julian said, gesturing with a flute of vintage Krug toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. Below, the city of Chicago moved in a gray, sluggish tide. It was mid-November, and a freezing sleet had begun to turn the streets into a slush of misery. The commuters, the value meal demographic, they don't eat. They merely fuel their own mediocrity. They lack the palate for consequence. Arthur, his chief of staff, stood in the shadows of the minimalist room. Arthur was a man of quiet surfaces, gray suits, gray hair, and an expression that rarely drifted from professional neutrality. He checked his tablet. "The quarterly earnings call is in 20 minutes, Julian. We need to address the supply chain protests in the Midwest. The Fair Plate initiative is gaining traction." Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Fairness is the consolation prize for the incompetent. If they want to eat like kings, they should have been born with the drive to rule. Tell the press that if the common laborer can't afford our artisanal truffle oils, they are more than welcome to stick to their synthetic margarines. It's a matter of biological destiny. Julian wasn't just arrogant. He was performative about it. He took a bite of a $400 cracker topped with Alma's caviar, the salt hitting his tongue like a cold electric shock. He relished the thought of his words hitting the news cycle. He lived for the friction. He believed that the more he was hated by the masses, the more he was adored by the shareholders, who saw his cruelty as a form of fiscal discipline. "I'll prepare the statement," Arthur said softly. "But I should warn you. The optics are volatile. There's a man outside the lobby. He's been there for 3 days. A former employee from the cannery we shuttered in Ohio. He's asking for a word." Julian turned, his eyes narrowing. "A word? I don't trade in words with ghosts, Arthur. I trade in margins. Have security remove him. He's an eyesore. He's ruining the aesthetic of the entrance." 10 minutes later, as Julian exited the gold-leafed elevators of the Vane Tower, he found the eyesore. The man was a heap of rags and shivering limbs, holding a sign that was melting in the sleet. His face was a map of exhaustion, his skin the color of wet pavement. Julian stopped. He didn't have to, but he wanted to. He wanted to feel the distance between them. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and looked at the man. The man's eyes flickered with a desperate, sudden hope. "You want this?" Julian asked, his voice smooth and cold. The man nodded, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Please, my daughter. She needs—" Julian crumpled the bill into a tight ball and dropped it into a nearby trash can that was currently filled with half-melted ice and cigarette butts. "Then go get it. Though I suspect the filth in there might actually improve your net worth." The man stared at the trash can, then at Julian. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, hollow silence. Julian smiled, adjusted his charcoal overcoat, and stepped into his waiting limousine. "The scent of failure is remarkably clingy," Julian muttered as the car pulled away. "Remind me to have the lobby deodorized tomorrow." "Of course, Julian," Arthur replied from the front seat. As the car glided through the rain, Julian watched the city lights blur. He felt invincible. He was the architect of an empire built on the exclusion of the many for the delight of the few. He didn't notice that Arthur was looking at him through the rearview mirror with a look that wasn't neutral at all. It was the look of a man who had finished a very long, very complex calculation. Julian felt a sudden sharp pinch in his neck. He reached up, his fingers brushing a small metallic dart. "Arthur?" Julian's voice was suddenly heavy, his tongue feeling like a lead weight. "The taste of poverty isn't just about the food, Julian," Arthur said, his voice calm and melodic. "It's about the invisibility. It's about being a ghost in your own life." Julian tried to reach for the door handle, but his muscles had turned to water. The world tilted, the expensive leather of the car seat rising up to swallow him. The last thing he saw was the man from the lobby, standing on the sidewalk, watching the limousine disappear into the dark. The transition from silk sheets to wet concrete wasn't a fall. It was an erasure. When Julian's eyes finally flickered open, the world was no longer composed of sharp lines and climate-controlled perfection. Instead, it was a blurred gray smear of damp air and the rhythmic, metallic dripping of an overhead pipe. He tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of vertigo sent him reeling back. His head throbbed with a chemical heaviness, a residual haze from whatever Arthur had injected into his veins. "Arthur," he croaked, but the name died in the vast, empty space of the warehouse. He wasn't in a hospital. He wasn't in a ransom cell. He was lying on a thin, grease-stained mattress in the corner of a cavernous industrial ruin. As the fog cleared, Julian looked down at his hands. They were caked in a fine layer of soot. His bespoke charcoal overcoat was gone, replaced by a threadbare, oversized army jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and old rain. His shoes, hand-stitched Italian leather, had been swapped for battered, mismatched sneakers with soles held on by silver duct tape. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He reached for his pocket, searching for his phone, his wallet, his identity. He found only a single crumpled transit pass and a small, rusted tin of cheap mints. Across the city, at the headquarters of Vane and Volition, the board of directors sat in a state of paralysis. At the head of the mahogany table sat Julian Vane, or, more accurately, the man who looked, moved, and spoke like Julian Vane. The man from the lobby, the one Julian had mocked by the trash can, was now draped in a $6,000 navy pinstripe suit. His skin had been scrubbed raw, his hair expertly coiffed by Julian's personal stylist, and his posture corrected by weeks of intensive physical coaching. He held a glass of mineral water with the exact, practiced elegance of a man born to wealth. Arthur stood behind him, his hands clasped firmly at the small of his back. "Gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "Mr. Vane has had a transformative weekend. He has some radical adjustments to propose for our fiscal strategy." The new Julian leaned forward. He didn't look like a beggar anymore. He looked like a predator who had finally found his rhythm. "The Fair Plate Initiative," the man said, his voice a perfect, chilling mimicry of Julian's mid-Atlantic drawl. "I was wrong about it. It's too small. It lacks ambition. Why settle for fairness when we can achieve total market disruption through radical philanthropy?" One of the board members, a silver-haired man named Sterling, blinked in confusion. "Radical philanthropy? Julian, we're a luxury brand. Our margins depend on exclusivity. If we lower the barrier, we lose the brand's soul." "The brand's soul is a fiction, Sterling," the man replied, tapping a manicured finger on the table. "The reality is that we sit on 24 distribution centers and $3 billion in liquid assets. Starting tomorrow, we begin the sunset liquidation. We will pivot from selling $200 jars of honey to providing high-density, nutrient-rich meals to the very zip codes we previously ignored. We are going to dismantle the ego of this company and feed it to the hungry." The room erupted. Arthur caught the man's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The plan was working. The man, whose real name was Silas, felt the weight of the suit, the artificiality of the role. He remembered the feeling of the cold sleet on his neck just 48 hours ago. He remembered his daughter's cough in their unheated apartment. Every word he spoke now was a nail in the coffin of the man who had discarded him like trash. Back in the warehouse, the real Julian Vane managed to crawl to his feet. He staggered toward a grimy window, looking out over the industrial wasteland of the South Side. He saw a puddle on the ground and looked at his reflection. He didn't recognize the hollow-eyed man staring back. He saw a television through the window of a pawn shop across the street. A news ticker flashed across the screen. "CEO Julian Vane announces massive asset liquidation to fund global soup kitchens." Julian's breath hitched. That's not me," he gasped, clawing at the window glass. "I'm here. I'm right here." A group of 3 men, their faces hardened by years of the street, shuffled past him. One of them stopped, looking Julian up and down with a mix of pity and contempt. "Quiet down, new meat," the man said, spitting on the ground. "Nobody likes a screamer. You're just like the rest of us now. Just another ghost." Julian backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized with a sickening jolt that Arthur hadn't just kidnapped him. He had deleted him. He was a billionaire with no proof of his existence, trapped in a body that the world had been trained to ignore. He felt a pang in his stomach, the first real gnawing growl of hunger he had felt in decades. It wasn't the refined appetite for caviar. It was a sharp, biting pain that demanded survival. He looked at the trash can in the corner of the room. The irony tasted like copper. The boardroom of Vane and Volition was no longer a sanctuary of quiet wealth. It had become a combat zone. Silas, wearing Julian's face like a polished mask, sat at the head of the table as the air hummed with the frantic energy of a collapsing empire. On the wall-mounted monitors, the company's stock ticker was a jagged red lightning bolt, plunging toward the floor. "You're a madman!" Sterling screamed, slamming his palms onto the mahogany. "The SEC is already calling. You can't just sign over the Ohio distribution hub to a nonprofit for a single dollar. That is shareholder theft." Silas didn't flinch. He channeled every ounce of Julian's trademark arrogance, leaning back with a cold, detached smile. "The shareholders invested in my vision, Sterling. My vision has simply expanded. We aren't losing value. We are investing in the survival of our future customer base. A dead population can't buy truffles, can they?" "This isn't about business, and we all know it," another director hissed. "This is a nervous breakdown. We are moving for an emergency injunction to have you removed on medical grounds." Arthur stepped forward, his presence as calming and dangerous as a deep-sea current. He placed a thick stack of folders on the table. "You're welcome to try. However, these documents, audited and signed by Mr. Vane months ago, establish a series of shell trusts that give him absolute discretionary power over these specific assets. If you move against him, he'll trigger the poison pill clause, and this company will be bankrupt by Friday. Do you want to save half the ship, or sink with the captain?" The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of defeat. Silas watched them, his heart hammering beneath his bespoke shirt. He wasn't Julian Vane, but he was learning that power was nothing more than the audacity to be cruel to those who thought they were your equals. While Silas played the king, the real Julian Vane was learning the geography of the gutter. It had been 36 hours since Julian had eaten. The hunger was no longer a growl, it was a physical weight, a dull ache that radiated from his spine to his teeth. He was standing in a line that stretched around a crumbling brick building on 4th Street. The St. Jude's Outreach sign flickered in the twilight. Beside him stood an elderly woman wrapped in 3 layers of sweaters, her hands shaking as she clutched a plastic tray. "First time?" she asked softly. Julian didn't look at her. His pride was a rotting tooth, painful to keep and agonizing to pull. "I don't belong here," he muttered, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. "There's been a mistake. I'm a CEO." The woman let out a dry, wheezing chuckle. "Honey, half the men in this line used to be somebody. This city doesn't care about what you used to be. It only cares if you're moving fast enough to stay warm." The line surged forward. Julian reached the industrial steel counter. A volunteer, a young girl with tired eyes, slapped a scoop of grayish-brown stew onto a partitioned plastic plate and slid a piece of stale bread next to it. Julian stared at the mess. This was the synthetic margarine demographic he had mocked. The smell was earthy, salty, and entirely unappealing. He looked at the plastic spoon, his mind flashing to the silver service at Le Bernardin. "Move it along," a voice barked from behind him. Julian took his tray to a long, sticky table. He took a bite. The stew was lukewarm and oversalted, but as it hit his stomach, his brain let out a primal scream of relief. He began to eat with a ferocity that terrified him. He wasn't tasting the ingredients. He was tasting the terrifying reality of his own fragility. He was nothing but a stomach and a heartbeat. Suddenly, a shadow fell over his table. 2 men, younger and broader than Julian, sat across from him. One of them reached out and snatched Julian's bread. "Hey!" Julian snapped, the old authority flaring for a brief, foolish second. "That's mine." The man leaned in, the scent of unwashed skin and aggression rolling off him. "You look like you've had enough bread in your life, old man. Give me the tray, or I'll give you a reason to visit the ER." Julian looked around. The room was full of people, but he was utterly alone. No security, no Arthur, no board of directors. For the first time in his life, Julian Vane felt the cold, sharp edge of physical fear. He pushed the tray toward the man and stood up, his legs trembling. He walked out into the freezing night, his stomach half empty and his spirit shattered. He found a piece of cardboard in an alleyway and curled up against a dumpster. The metal was freezing, drawing the last of his body heat into the trash. As he closed his eyes, he saw Silas's face on a giant digital billboard across the street. His own face, smiling down with a benevolence he had never possessed. The headline read, "Vane announces total debt forgiveness for low-income vendors." Julian let out a sob that was lost in the wind. He was being erased by his own kindness, a kindness he had never intended to give. He realized then that the taste of poverty wasn't the food. It was the realization that your life could be stolen, improved, and given away, and the world would celebrate your disappearance. The gold-rimmed clock in the executive suite chimed midnight, but the lights remained blindingly bright. Silas sat at Julian's desk, staring at a legal document that would effectively dissolve the Vane and Volition Holding Company into a public trust. His hand hovered over the signature line. The fountain pen, a bespoke instrument worth more than Silas's previous life, feeling like a 1,000-pound weight. "If you sign that, there's no going back," Arthur said from the doorway. He looked tired for the first time, the calculated precision of his demeanor fraying at the edges. "The board has filed for a mental competency hearing. The police are starting to ask questions about the new Julian's sudden change in personality. We're running out of runway." Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I spent 10 years working in the Ohio cannery. 10 years of breathing in lye and steam so Julian Vane could buy a third yacht. When he closed the plant, he didn't just take my job, he took my daughter's health. We couldn't afford the inhalers. We couldn't afford the heat." He looked at the pen. "I'm not Julian Vane. I'm the ghost he created, and ghosts don't care about runway." "You're losing the objective, Silas," Arthur warned, stepping into the light. "The objective was to redistribute the hoard. If you get caught now, they'll reverse every transaction. They'll call it a fraud and reclaim every cent from the soup kitchens and the housing projects. You have to remain Julian until the legal locks are unbreakable." "I can't keep his voice in my head anymore," Silas whispered. "Every time I look in the mirror, I see the man who told me to find $100 in a trash can. I'm disappearing, Arthur. I'm becoming the very thing I hate." While Silas struggled with the weight of the crown, the real Julian Vane was reaching his own breaking point in the mud. Julian was no longer the man who lived for margins. He was a creature of pure survival. He had spent the last 3 days huddled under a bridge near the Chicago River, watching the new Julian on a discarded tablet someone had left charging near a public outlet. He watched his own face promise a new era of human dignity. He watched his own bank accounts being drained to build medical clinics in the very neighborhoods he used to joke about leveling for luxury condos. The rage that had sustained him was being replaced by a terrifying clarity. He looked at his hands, cracked, bleeding, and stained with the grime of a city that had forgotten him. He realized that the world didn't miss Julian Vane. It preferred the version of him that cared. "He's not me," Julian hissed to the shadows. "He's a lie." "Does it matter?" a voice rasped. Julian turned. It was the man from the soup kitchen, the one who had stolen his bread. He was sitting on a crate, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. "He's stealing my life," Julian screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete pilings. "Your life was a cage, man," the thief said, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke. "I know who you are, or who you were. We all do. We saw the news. We saw you mock that guy in the rain. Everyone under this bridge knows exactly who old Julian was." Julian froze. "You knew?" And you let me starve? Why should we help a man who spent his whole life making sure we didn't exist? The thief stood up, his shadow looming large. But that guy on the TV? The one who looks like you? He just opened a shelter 3 blocks from here. Heated floors, real beds. He's doing more for us in a week than you did in 50 years. So, if you go back there and try to reclaim your life, you're not just fighting him, you're fighting all of us. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. He wasn't just displaced, he was obsolete. The new Julian was a better version of himself. The world was healing because he had been removed from it. Driven by a final desperate impulse, Julian scrambled up the embankment. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself standing in front of the Vane Tower. The rain was turning to snow. He looked at the glass doors, the gold trim, the security guards who would now see him as a vagrant to be pepper-sprayed. He saw a black limousine pull up to the curb. The door opened, and Silas stepped out, flanked by Arthur. For a heartbeat, the two Julians made eye contact, the billionaire in rags and the beggar in silk. The air between them hummed with a jagged, electric tension. Silas stopped, his hand trembling as he adjusted his coat. He saw the hollowed-out wreck of the man he was mimicking, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he didn't expect. Pity. "Sir," Arthur whispered, sensing the danger. "We need to move." Julian opened his mouth to scream, to point, to reclaim his empire. But as he looked at Silas, at the man who was using his name to save lives, his voice failed him. He saw the crowd gathered across the street, people holding signs that read, "Vane for the people." If he spoke the truth, the hope would die. If he remained silent, he would die. Julian Vane, the man of 1,000 words, found he had nothing left to say. He turned away from the gold doors and disappeared into the swirling white of the storm. The snow didn't just fall, it buried. By morning, the city of Chicago was a muffled white tomb. Inside the executive suite of Vane Tower, the silence was even thicker. Silas sat at the mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the final page of the dissolution papers. The Sunset liquidation was complete. With one signature, the Vane fortune would be permanently locked into a global trust, untouchable by the board, the courts, or even Julian himself. The door clicked shut. Arthur walked in, carrying a single suitcase. He wasn't wearing his gray suit. He was dressed in a simple, anonymous navy peacoat. "The car is waiting at the service entrance," Arthur said. "The board has successfully obtained the injunction for a medical evaluation. They'll be here with the police in 20 minutes. If you're going to leave, Silas, it has to be now." Silas looked at the signature on the page. It was a perfect forgery, the elegant, aggressive J and the sharp, dismissive V. "What happens to him?" Silas asked, his voice low. "The man under the bridge?" Arthur walked to the window, looking down at the white-shrouded streets. "Julian Vane died last night. Not physically, perhaps, but the man who owned this building no longer exists. He has no ID, no access to funds, and the only people who recognize him are those who have every reason to keep him in the gutter. He is exactly what he feared most, a statistic." Silas signed the final page with a jagged stroke. He felt a strange, hollow lightness. "Why did you do it, Arthur? You were his right hand for 15 years. You could have just quit. You could have sued him. Why this theatrical execution?" Arthur turned, and for the first time, the mask of the perfect chief of staff dropped. His eyes weren't cold. They were burning with a quiet, ancient fire. "My mother worked in one of Julian's father's textile mills. When the looms were automated, they fired her 2 weeks before her pension vested. She spent the rest of her life cleaning the offices of men like Julian. She died of a preventable infection because she couldn't afford the luxury of a doctor's visit." Arthur stepped closer to the desk. "I didn't spend 15 years serving Julian Vane because I admired him. I spent 15 years learning the plumbing of his empire so that when the time came, I could flush it all away. You weren't a random choice, Silas. I've been watching you since the day the Ohio plant closed. I needed a man with a reason to hate him, and a face that could be molded into his." And now? Silas stood up, shedding the $6,000 blazer. He felt like he was stepping out of a suit of armor that had started to crush him. What happens to us? We disappear, Arthur said simply. The new Julian will be reported as having fled the country to avoid the competency hearing. The assets are already moved. The clinics are funded. The soup kitchens have 20 years of operating capital. We go back to being the ghosts we were always meant to be. As they exited through the service elevator, bypassing the frantic board members arriving in the lobby, the real Julian Vane was miles away. Julian sat in a heated plastic chair inside the Vane Community Center in the South Side. The air smelled of floor wax and industrial soup. A television mounted on the wall showed a breaking news report. Julian Vane missing. Police search for disgraced CEO after massive asset transfer. Julian stared at his own face on the screen. He looked at his hands, the fingernails broken, the skin stained. He was eating a bowl of the same stew he had once called synthetic. It was warm, it was filling. A young man sat down across from him, sliding a newspaper over. "Did you hear? The bastard's gone. Ran off with whatever was left, they say. But at least he left the lights on for us before he bolted." Julian looked at the man. He could tell him. He could scream that he was the man on the screen. He could explain the complexity of the trust, the illegality of the signatures, the betrayal of a chief of staff who had played them all. But as he looked around the room, at the families sleeping in clean beds, at the children eating without fear, at the warmth that his stolen wealth had provided, he felt a crushing weight lift from his chest. If he took back his life, he would have to take back the cruelty. He would have to become the monster again just to prove he existed. "Yeah," Julian said, his voice raspy and unfamiliar. "I heard." He picked up his spoon and took another bite. The taste was no longer copper or salt. It was simple. It was survival. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the footprints of the man who had been a king and the man who had been a ghost. In the end, the empire didn't fall to a revolution or a stock market crash. It fell because a man who had everything finally learned the cost of a single bowl of soup. Julian Vane finished his meal, stood up, and joined the line of men waiting for their second helping. He was no longer a CEO, a billionaire, or a villain. He was just a man in the cold, finally learning that the only thing more expensive than power was the price of a soul. The world moved on, the stock stabilized, the names changed, but under the bridges and in the shelters, the legacy of a man who never existed continued to feed the hungry. The taste of poverty had been replaced by the quiet, sustaining taste of enough.
Did the story teach you something about your own life? Share in the comments, because your perspective might help someone else feel seen. And if the story moved you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs to remember their own value. Welcome to Power Reclaimed, stories focused on workplace conflict, corporate betrayal, power struggles, and quiet justice. We follow structured workflows to deliver a consistent, immersive experience. We start by analyzing real discussions on Reddit, Facebook, Quora, and blogs, and bring together the idea for the story. Next, we craft original scripts using AI tools like Google Gemini. We then use an AI program to animate a talking avatar, which is incredibly accurate in creating subtitles and has excellent lip-syncing and human-sounding voices, which, in our opinion, are industry-leading. We carefully edit everything in Adobe Premiere Pro for a smooth finish, and then use Handbrake to get the file size down while retaining quality. Thumbnails are carefully designed using Photoshop and AI, and are prompted not only to be visually appealing to viewers, but are designed to accurately depict what the story is about. We carefully review each video before release to ensure accuracy and quality. These stories go beyond entertainment, revealing how power truly works and how justice quietly unfolds. I hope you enjoyed the video and consider subscribing to the channel.